Part 1 Exposition Red Dust of Dry Creek. The sun over the New Mexico Territory in 1879 was not a gentle thing. It was a hammer, beating down on the cracked earth of Dry Creek until the very air shimmered. Red dust, fine as flour, settled on everything, on the drooping leaves of the lone cottonwood, on the salt-stained flanks of weary horses, and on the determined set of Lila Hart's shoulders as she worked the old well. The squeal of the wooden pulley was the first sound of her morning and often the last of her day. It was a song of labor, a familiar ache in her bones. Each turn of the crank was a memory of her father, a man of books and quiet words who had dug this well with his own hands, believing that water, like knowledge, should be shared. Now, he was gone, and the well, on the small plot of land that was her only inheritance, was her burden and her anchor. Lila's palms, calloused and strong, guided the fraying rope. The bucket emerged from the cool dark, dripping silver tears onto the parched ground. She worked with a rhythm born of necessity, hauling water for Rosie Quinn's stagecoach stop, earning enough to keep body and soul together and to protect this patch of earth. In her mind's eye, it wasn't just a dusty lot. It was the future site of the Dry Creek School, a place for the children of miners and ranch hands to learn their letters, a dream her father had spoken of in hushed, hopeful tones. She had just tipped the second bucket into the wooden yoke across her shoulders when a shadow fell over her. It was long and sharp in the morning light, and it belonged to a man who moved as if he owned the ground he stood on. "That's good. Deep water, girl," Boone Avery said. His voice was like gravel grinding in a dry creek bed. He was Judge Pike's foreman, a man whose authority came from the Colt peacemaker on his hip and the cruelty in his eyes. Two other men from Pike's slaughterhouse lounged behind him, their expressions vacant and mean. Lila said nothing, settling the weight of the water across her back. Her heart began a low, heavy thud against her ribs, a drumbeat of old fear. She knew men like this, men who saw a woman alone as an opportunity. "The judge has been thinking," Boone continued, stepping closer, blocking her path. The smell of cured meat and sweat rolled off him. "He's thinking it ain't right for one person to be drawing from a community resource without contributing." Lila's gaze remained fixed on the Oregon mountains, a hazy purple line on the horizon. "This well is on my land," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "My father's land." Boone chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Land needs water. Water is Pike's business now. He figures a fee is in order. For the upkeep, let's call it 2 bits a day." 2 bits. It was half her daily earnings. It was theft, plain and simple. But it wasn't about the money. It was about the principle. It was a boot pressing down, testing to see how much she would yield. The memory of another man, another place, another act of brutish power flashed behind her eyes, hot and suffocating. She blinked it away, forcing her spine to stay straight. "The well needs no upkeep from Judge Pike," she replied, her knuckles white where she gripped the yoke. "It has given water freely for 20 years. Boone's smile vanished. He took another step, his dusty boot prints overlapping the smaller ones she had made. "Everything in Dry Creek has a price. The judge sets it. You'll pay starting tomorrow, or we'll board this hole up." He gestured with his chin at the well. "Your choice." He and his men sauntered off, their laughter scraping the quiet morning air. Lila stood frozen, the water sloshing in the buckets, the weight on her shoulders suddenly immense. She looked down at the well, its stone lip worn smooth by years of use. It was more than a hole in the ground. It was the last piece of her father, the only hope for her future, and Ephraim Pike was going to take it. Miles away, Cole Mercer tasted the same red dust. It coated his throat and gritted between his teeth as he guided the last of the calves toward the town's communal trough. They were a scrawny bunch, sold for a pittance by a homesteader whose luck had run dry. Cole's job was simple: drive them to the railhead north of town. It was seasonal work, anonymous and transient, which suited him just fine. A man on the move couldn't cause much harm. He rode with his hat brim pulled low, his face a mask of sun-weathered neutrality. He had learned to be an observer, to see the currents of a town without getting swept up in them. Dry Creek's current was sluggish and murky, and it all flowed toward one man, Judge Pike. Cole had heard the whispers at every campfire and saloon from here to the Rio Grande. Pike was buying up land, controlling the water, and squeezing the life out of anyone who stood in his way. The law, in the form of the corpulent and compliant Sheriff Caro, looked the other way. It was the old, ugly story of the West. The man with the most guns and the longest reach made the rules. Cole had no interest in the rules of Dry Creek. His plan was to water the cattle, grab some supplies, and be gone by noon. He kept his head down, focusing on the bellowing calves jostling for a place at the trough. That's when he saw them. Boone Avery and his two cronies, having finished their business with Lila, were now blocking the public trough, letting their horses drink long and deep while Cole's calves milled about, their tongues lolling with thirst. Cole reined in his buckskin, waiting. Patience was a tool, one he'd sharpened during his years scouting for the railroad, but Boone was in no hurry. He took his time, dismounting to splash water on his face, making a show of his dominance. Finally, Cole nudged his horse forward. "Mister," he said, his voice even, "my cattle have been on the trail since dawn. I'd appreciate it if you'd let them drink." Boone turned slowly. He sized Cole up the worn denim, the dusty chaps, the stoic silence of a man accustomed to his own company. He saw a drifter, nobody of consequence. "These horses work hard for Judge Pike," Boone sneered. "They drink first. Your bony cows can wait." One of the other men laughed. Cole felt a familiar heat rise in his chest. It was the slow burn of anger, an old friend he tried to keep at a distance. He thought of the fire, the splintering crash, the roar of the flames, the screams he could still hear in the dead of night. A moment of his own anger, a stupid brawl in a rail yard, had put him on that train. His intervention had led to disaster. He had sworn to himself he would never again be the spark that starts the blaze. He looked at the thirsty calves, then at Boone's smirking face. He could push it, a word, a move toward the gun on his hip, and this would escalate. Men would be watching. A reputation, for good or ill, would be forged in this dust, and then he would be tied to this place. He couldn't afford that. He wasn't worthy of that. Cole gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He backed his horse away, his jaw tight. "They'll wait," he said, the words tasting like ash. He turned his attention to his herd, his movements calm and deliberate. But his eyes had noted every detail the way Boone's men moved, the deference in the eyes of the townsfolk who watched from the boardwalk, the greasy sheen on Sheriff Caro's badge as the lawman observed from his office window before turning away. Cole saw the whole rotten structure, held together by fear, and he saw his own complicity in it. Another small act of cowardice that allowed men like Boone and Pike to thrive. As he waited, he heard the gossip drifting from the general store. "Digging a new canal, straight from the source. Gonna dry up the whole lower valley by summer's end. Pike will own every drop. What can anyone do? He is the law here." Cole's gaze drifted down the street, settling on a lone figure walking with a heavy wooden yoke across her shoulders. He watched as she delivered the water to the stagecoach stop, her movements weary but unbroken. He didn't know who she was, but he saw the rigid set of her spine, and he recognized the look of a person bracing against a storm. He had seen it in the mirror often enough. That evening, the oppressive heat finally broke, but the air remained thick with tension. At the stagecoach stop, Lila counted her coins, the meager sum feeling lighter than usual. Rosie Quinn, a woman whose kindness was perpetually at war with her fear of trouble, wrung her hands. "You should just pay him." "Lila," Rosie whispered, glancing nervously out the door. It's not right, but Pike is not a man to be crossed. Your father, bless his soul, was a man of principle. But principles don't keep you safe in a town like this. If I pay, he'll just demand more tomorrow, Lila said, tucking the coins into her pocket. It's the well he wants. Rosie, the land. Then what will you do? I will keep drawing water, Lila said simply. It's mine to draw. Her defiance felt fragile, a thin shield against a coming onslaught. As she walked home, the setting sun painted the sky in brutal shades of orange and red, the color of rust and dried blood. The dust of Dry Creek settled around her, a constant, choking presence. The next morning, she was at the well before sunrise, but she wasn't the only one. A notice had been nailed to the old wooden frame of the well house. It was written in a florid, official-looking script, stamped with a wax seal that bore a large P. It was a legal claim. The document was a tangle of legalese, but the meaning was clear. It declared the plot of land and the well upon it to be common property, subject to seizure by the township of Dry Creek to settle an outstanding tax debt left by one Mr. Alistair Hart. Lila's blood ran cold. Her father had been meticulous. He paid every debt. This was a lie, a fabrication spun from Pike's greed. At the bottom, in bold, stark letters, was the final pronouncement, signed by Ephraim Pike, Justice of the Peace. The property is to be surrendered within 7 days. 7 days. It was a death sentence for her dream. She tore the notice from the wood, the paper crinkling in her trembling hand. She looked around at the silent, dusty town, already coming to life under the rising sun. She was alone. Pike had the law, the guns, and the money. All she had was this piece of paper, this well, and a stubborn refusal to be broken. The old, familiar fear rose up, but this time, something else rose with it. A quiet, burning anger. Her father had taught her to read, to think, to stand for what was right. Pike was about to find out how well she had learned her lessons. Part 2. Inciting Incident. The night at the stage stop. 3 days of the 7 had passed, each one a silent turn of the hourglass. The sun continued its relentless assault, baking the defiance out of the land, but not out of Lila Hart. She continued her work, drawing water from the well, her every movement a quiet act of rebellion. But the nights were the hardest. The darkness brought no relief, only a different kind of heat, a thick, oppressive anxiety that settled in her chest. This particular night the sky was a bruised purple, torn by silent veins of lightning, a dry storm, or the fury of a tempest with none of the release of rain. The wind, hot as a blacksmith's forge, rattled the shutters of Rosie Quinn's stagecoach stop and whipped dust into ghostly devils that danced down the empty street. Inside, the air was stale and heavy. A single lantern cast long, flickering shadows. Cole Mercer had been delayed. One of the calves had thrown a shoe, and the blacksmith, a stooped, weary man named Silas, had taken his time with the repair. So Cole found himself nursing a lukewarm beer at a corner table, waiting for the farrier's work to be done. He had intended to be 50 miles north by now, away from the simmering pot of Dry Creek. Instead, he was stuck in its heart, an unwilling witness to the town's slow decay. Lila was there, sweeping the floorboards with methodical strokes. Her shift had ended an hour ago, but Rosie, unnerved by the menacing sky and the even more menacing mood that had gripped the town since Pike's notice went up, had asked her to stay for a while, company against the encroaching dark. "You're a stubborn girl, Lila," Rosie said, polishing an already clean glass, just like your father. He always believed a well-reasoned argument could stop a bull in its tracks. I told him some bulls don't listen to reason. He also believed you don't give up what's yours just because the bull is loud, Lila answered, not pausing her sweeping. She was acutely aware of the man in the corner, the drifter who had backed down from Boone Avery at the water trough. She didn't blame him. She understood the instinct to avoid trouble, but a small, uncharitable part of her felt a pang of disappointment. It was the same disappointment she felt in the whole town, in a world where good people stepped aside for loud, violent men. Cole kept his eyes on his beer, but he heard every word. He felt the weight of the woman's unspoken judgment. Coward. The word didn't need to be said. He'd been calling himself that for a year. He took a long swallow of the bitter brew. It was better this way. A coward didn't drag others into his fire. The front door flew open with a bang that made both women jump. Boone Avery filled the doorway, flanked by the same two thugs from the well. The hot wind swirled in with them, carrying the scent of dust and malice. Boone's eyes, small and dark, scanned the room and settled on Lila. "Working late?" he asked, his voice slick with false courtesy. He swaggered in, his spurs ringing on the floorboards. His men spread out, blocking the door. Rosie stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped them on her apron. "We're closing up. Boone, whatever you want, it can wait till morning." "Oh, I don't think it can." "Rosie?" Boone said, his gaze never leaving Lila. "The judge is a man who likes his paperwork in order. We've come for the deed to that little plot of yours. Girl, save everyone a lot of trouble in a few days' time." Lila's hand tightened on the broom handle. She could feel the small, oilskin-wrapped packet tucked securely in the inner pocket of her dress. It was a physical weight against her ribs, a constant reminder of what was at stake. "The deed is not yours," she said, her voice low and steady, "and you are not welcome here." In the corner, Cole went still, every muscle in his body tensed. "Leave. Get up and walk out now. This is not your fight. This is how it starts. A word, a look, and then the fire." He kept his head down, staring into the amber liquid in his glass, commanding himself to be invisible. Boone laughed. "Feisty. The judge likes that. Says it makes things more interesting when they finally break." He took a step toward her. "Now, are you going to give it to me? Or do my boys and I have to turn this place upside down looking for it?" He nodded to one of his men, who promptly knocked a stack of clean plates from a table. They shattered on the floor. "Stop it," Rosie cried out. "You have no right." "We have all the right in the world," Boone snarled, his patience gone. He lunged for Lila. She brought the broom up like a quarterstaff, blocking him. It was a brave, foolish gesture. He wrenched it from her grasp and tossed it aside. "I'm done asking." He loomed over her. Lila stood her ground, her chin lifted, her eyes blazing with a fear she refused to show. And then it happened. The sound was sharp, ugly, and final. Boone's open hand connected with her cheek. It wasn't a shove. It was a deliberate, contemptuous strike meant to humiliate, to assert dominance. Lila's head snapped to the side. A stunned silence fell over the room, broken only by the whistling wind outside. For Cole, the world stopped. The sound of the slap was a gunshot in the quiet room of his memory. It was the sound of a bully winning. It was the crack of a whip, the slam of a door, the splintering of wood just before the flames. It was the sound of injustice he had run from for a year, and in that instant, he knew he was done running. He didn't say a word. The chair scraped back from his table, a harsh, grating sound. 3 sets of eyes swiveled toward him. Boone's face twisted into a sneer of disbelief. "Well, look what we have here. The cattle driver who lost his nerve. You got something to say?" Cole's eyes were flat, cold, and empty of everything but a chilling resolve. He didn't look at Boone. He looked at Lila, at the red mark blooming on her cheek. He saw the flicker of shame and defiance in her eyes. "You shouldn't have done that," Cole said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried across the room with the weight of a gravestone. Boone guffawed. "And what are you going to do about it?" "Drifter!" Cole didn't answer with words. He moved. It wasn't the clumsy rush of a barroom brawler. It was a fluid, economical explosion of violence. He took 2 long strides, And before Boone's men could react, he slammed the heel of his palm under the chin of the man closest to him. The man's head snapped back. His teeth clacked together, and he staggered into a table, dazed. Cole pivoted, grabbing the wrist of the second man as he reached for his pistol, twisting it brutally until the man cried out and the gun clattered to the floor. It took less than 5 seconds. Now it was just him and Boone. Boone, momentarily stunned, fumbled for his own Colt. He was fast, but Cole was faster. Cole's pistol was already out, the hammer cocked, the dark eye of the barrel fixed on a point just above Boone's head. The room erupted in a deafening roar. Flame and smoke belched from Cole's gun. Plaster and wood splinters exploded from the wall. Inches from Boone's ear. Outside, a massive fork of lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in a stark, ghostly flash. In that split second of brilliant light, Lila saw it a pale, jagged scar that snaked across the back of Cole's wrist and disappeared under his sleeve. A burn mark. Boone froze, his hand hovering over the butt of his pistol. The smell of sulfur filled the room. He stared at the smoking hole in the wall, then at the man holding the gun. The drifter's face was unreadable, his hand steady as a rock. There was no anger in his eyes, no bravado. There was something far more terrifying, absolute certainty. Boone Avery was a bully, and like all bullies, he understood the calculus of violence. He knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity, that if he completed his draw, he would be dead before his gun cleared leather. Slowly, deliberately, Boone raised his hands, a gesture of surrender that was also a promise of future vengeance. "You just signed your own death warrant, drifter!" he hissed, his voice trembling with rage. Cole didn't flinch. He gestured with the barrel of his gun toward the door. "Get your men and get out." Boone backed away slowly, his eyes burning with hatred. He helped his dazed cronies to their feet and shoved them toward the exit. At the doorway, he paused and pointed a shaking finger at Cole. "This ain't over," he spat. "The judge will hear about this. You've made a terrible mistake. He'll take everything from you. And from her." Then they were gone, swallowed by the howling wind and the night. A profound silence descended upon the room. Rosie was pressed against the back wall, her face pale. Lila stood rooted to the spot, her hand covering the sting on her cheek, her mind reeling. The air was thick with the aftershock of the confrontation. Cole uncocked his pistol and holstered it. The sudden violent energy seemed to drain out of him, leaving him looking weary and burdened. He bent down and picked up the gun his attacker had dropped, placing it on the bar. He avoided looking at Lila. "He'll be back," he said to the room at large. "With more men, you ladies should find a safe place." Lila finally found her voice. It was tight, strained. "Thank you." The words felt inadequate. She was grateful, deeply grateful, but another feeling warred with it, a fierce, bitter resentment. She hated this vulnerability. She hated that her fate had been decided in a clash of male aggression, even if it had been on her behalf. She didn't want a champion. She wanted justice. Cole finally met her eyes. He saw the complex storm there, the gratitude, the anger, the fear, and he saw his own failure reflected in them. He had broken his vow. He had intervened, and just as Boone had promised, he had likely made everything worse for this woman. He had painted a target on her back, and on his own. The fire was coming for them now. "It wasn't a choice," he said, his voice rough with a self-loathing she couldn't possibly understand. He turned, tossed a few coins on the table for his untouched beer, and walked toward the door. He paused on the threshold, his silhouette framed by the lightning-lit street. "Barricade the door, and stay away from the windows." He stepped out into the dry, electric fury of the storm, leaving Lila Hart in a shattered room, clutching a hidden deed, now bound to a stranger by an act of terrible, necessary kindness. The first real shot in the war for Dry Creek had been fired. Part 3, Rising Action 1, Water, Taxes, and Testimony. The dawn that followed the dry storm was unnaturally quiet. The wind had died, leaving a suffocating stillness over Dry Creek. The air was charged, not with electricity, but with unspoken words and watchful eyes. Cole had not left. He'd spent the night in the livery stable, his saddle for a pillow. The image of a red mark on a pale cheek burned into his mind. He'd told himself he was just waiting for the trail to clear, but he knew it was a lie. He had thrown a stone into the town's murky pond, and he felt a grim responsibility to see the ripples. Lila was at the well. As always, her movements were stiff, her cheek a dull ache. Every person who passed by seemed to know what had happened. Some offered looks of pity, others of fear, but most simply looked away, their silence a testament to Judge Pike's long shadow. The frayed rope of the well pulley felt heavier in her hands, each turn a laborious effort against a current of despair. Patience, her father had always said, was the art of hoping. Right now, hope felt like a distant country, seeking something more than the town's averted gazes. She made her way to the old adobe church, its bell silent in the morning heat. Padre Esteban was tending his small garden of chili peppers and herbs, his weathered face creased with concern. He was a man who saw the town's soul, and he knew it was ailing. "I heard there was trouble." "Lila," he said, his voice gentle as he wiped his earthy hands on his cassock. "Judge Pike claims my father died in debt to the town," Lila said, the words tasting like poison. "He wants the land. He has a paper, a legal notice." The priest's dark eyes grew sad. He beckoned her inside, into the cool, dark sanctuary that smelled of old wood, wax, and faith. From a heavy wooden chest, he retrieved a large, leather-bound book, the parish records. He opened it to a page from 3 years prior, his finger tracing a line of elegant, faded script. "Here," he said, "your father, Alistair Hart. He made a significant donation to the church to repair the roof the very month he passed. He paid in full for his burial plot." This was not a man who left debts. He then led her to a smaller office where the town's civic ledgers were kept for safekeeping, away from the saloon fires and whiskey spills of the sheriff's office. He found the tax roll for the year in question. "Look here," he whispered, pointing at the page listing her father's property. The entry was written in a slightly darker ink than the name surrounding it. The penmanship was stiff, unnaturally perfect, unlike the hurried scrawl on the rest of the page. At the bottom, a smudged line read, "Tax of $2 outstanding." "This page has been replaced," the padre stated, his voice tight with conviction. "The binding is newer here. The paper is cleaner. I am a keeper of books, my child. I know the feel of an honest page and the look of a lie. This is a forgery." Lila stared at the doctored ledger. It was one thing to feel an injustice. It was another to see the proof of its mechanics. This was not just Boone Avery's brutishness. This was a cold, calculated crime. Can we prove it? Against the word of Judge Pike in a court he controls. The priest shook his head slowly. A lie on paper is still a powerful weapon. "We need more." She left the church with a heavier heart, but a clearer mind. The fight was not just hers. It was a fight for the truth itself. Her path took her past the smithy, where the rhythmic clang of a hammer on anvil rang out. Nora Bell, her husband lost to a mine collapse the previous year, now worked the forge herself. A tall, capable woman with soot on her brow and biceps corded with muscle. She was hammering a glowing horseshoe into shape. "Heard Boone paid you a visit," Nora said without preamble, not missing a beat with her hammer. "Took a brave man to stand up to him." Her comment was directed at the memory of the night, but her eyes, when she glanced at Lila, held a deep, knowing respect. "I came about the crank on my well," Lila said, changing the subject. "It's slipping." Nora nodded, quenching the horseshoe in a trough with a great hiss of steam. "I can fix it, but there's something you should see first." She led Lila around to the back of the smithy, to a patch of freshly dug earth. My quenching trough ran dry, aquifers getting lower by the day. I was digging a new pit, deeper, when I hit this. Sticking out of the packed dirt was an iron pipe, about 3 inches in diameter, crusted with rust and soil. It pointed in the general direction of Lila's well. "It's new," Nora said, tapping it with the toe of her boot. "Runs straight toward Pike's slaughterhouse. He's not just trying to take your well, Lila. He's already stealing the water from right under it, sucking the whole aquifer dry to wash down his killing floor while the rest of us are rationing." Here was the more the Padre had spoken of. A physical crime, buried in the dirt. It was proof that Pike's greed went deeper than a single plot of land. He was bleeding the entire town, drop by secret drop. But as Lila stared at the illicit pipe, a new wave of fear washed over her. This was not a man who would be stopped by a forged ledger or a hidden pipe. He would simply bury his crimes deeper, as if summoned by her thoughts. A figure of authority appeared down the street. Sheriff Caro, his belly straining the buttons of his vest, walked toward her with an air of profound self-importance. Cole, watching from the shade of the livery's overhang, saw him and felt the hairs on his neck stand up. This was the next move in Pike's game. "Miss Hart," Caro said, stopping before her. He ignored Nora completely. "I've been instructed by Judge Pike, in his official capacity, to open an investigation into the dispute over your father's property." "There is no dispute," Lila said, her voice shaking slightly. "There is a lie." Caro sighed, a weary, put-upon sound. "That's for the law to decide. To that end, I'll need to take your copy of the land deed into evidence. For official examination." He held out a fleshy hand. It was a trap. If she refused, she was obstructing justice. If she agreed, she was handing over her only legal weapon. She thought of the real deed, the one her father had filed with the territorial office, still wrapped in oilskin against her chest. What Caro wanted was the worn copy her father had kept, the one she'd always carried. It was a bluff, but a dangerous one. "You will give me a receipt," Lila demanded, her mind racing. Of course, all official," Caro said impatiently. With trembling hands, she retrieved the folded, yellowed copy from a small pouch at her waist and handed it over. Caro scribbled a receipt and gave it to her, his eyes avoiding hers. He turned and walked away, the paper clutched in his hand like a prize. Lila felt as if she had just been disarmed in the middle of a battlefield. She was left holding a useless slip of paper while the sheriff walked off with her claim. Cole watched the entire exchange, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He'd seen this before on the railroad lands. The law wasn't a shield for the weak. It was a club for the powerful. He had stayed, thinking he could help. But what good was a gun against a pen when the man holding the pen owned the law? He found her later that afternoon at the edge of town, standing in the sparse shade of a mesquite tree, staring out at the vast, indifferent landscape. The defeat was plain on her face. He didn't say anything at first, just stood a respectful distance away. Finally, he spoke. He won't stop with the paper. Lila flinched, startled by his presence. "I know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I have nothing left to fight him with." "That's not true," Cole said quietly. He unstrapped the Colt from his hip and held it out to her. "Handle first. Knowledge is a weapon. Your father might have said, skill is, too." She stared at the gun as if it were a snake. "I don't know how." "I'll teach you," he said, "not to be like them, not to seek a fight, but to end one if it finds you. I'll teach you how to make a warning count, how to stand your ground without taking a life." She hesitated, her fear of the weapon warring with the greater fear of her own powerlessness. She thought of Boone's hand striking her face, of Sheriff Caro snatching her deed. She nodded. They went to a secluded arroyo, a deep scar in the earth where no one from town would see or hear them. For the next hour, there was only the sun, the dust, and Cole's calm, patient voice. He showed her how to stand, how to breathe, how to hold the heavy weapon until it felt like an extension of her will. He taught her to respect its power, not to relish it. This was not about anger. It was about control, about survival. When she finally fired a shot at an old tin can, the recoil jarring her arm, the sound was not just a bang. It was the sound of her fear being given a voice. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the canyon, Padre Esteban found them. He was holding a thin, sealed envelope. "I have been praying," the priest said, his face grave. "And I remembered this. Your father gave it to me the week before he died. He said if anything ever happened, and if you were ever in true peril, I was to give it to you." Lila took the letter. Her father's familiar handwriting swam before her eyes. It was not a will or a legal document, but a letter from a father to the daughter he knew he would be leaving behind. It spoke of his pride, his love, and his fears for her in a hard world. And then, in the final paragraph, she read the words that changed everything. "Should you ever need to hide what is most precious, remember the stories I told you of the masons of old. Look to the foundation. Beneath the southern lip of the well, there is a hollow stone, the one marked with a small, imperfect star I chiseled myself. It was our secret place for childhood treasures. May it keep your future safe now." Lila looked up from the letter, her eyes wide. She looked at Cole, then back at the priest. The copy of the deed was gone. The law was against her. The town was silent. But her father, a man of books and quiet words, had left her one last weapon. Hidden in plain sight, he had left her a piece of the truth, buried in stone. Part 4, Rising Action 2, The Well. The father's letter was a key, but the lock was a well that stood in the open heart of a hostile town, with only 4 days left until Pike's deadline. Lila knew she couldn't risk searching for the hollow stone in broad daylight. Any unusual activity at the well would bring Boone Avery and his thugs running. So she began a vigil. Each morning, in the deep blue dark before dawn, she would walk to the well and simply stand there, a silent guardian, a sentinel for her own legacy. Her presence was a claim, a quiet declaration that this ground was still hers. The first morning was the loneliest. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Then, as the eastern sky began to pale from black to gray, a lone rider emerged from the gloom. It was Cole. He didn't stop, didn't call out. He simply rode past on his buckskin, his pace steady, and as he drew parallel to her, he lifted his hand and tipped the brim of his hat. It was a small gesture, a flicker in the vast emptiness. But to Lila, it felt like a lighthouse beam. He had stayed. He was watching. She was not entirely alone. He passed the same way the next morning, and the next, on the third day. After his silent greeting, he paused his horse a few yards down the path. He dismounted, took a small, empty ammunition crate from his saddle, and set it on the ground near the well. Then he got back on his horse and rode away without a word. When Lila's legs grew tired, she sat on the crate. The wood was solid beneath her. It was the most practical, least romantic, and most profoundly moving gift she had ever received. It was a gift of understanding. Cole knew she was tired, but he also knew she would not quit. He had not offered to stand guard for her. He had not tried to take her burden. He had simply made it a little easier for her to bear it herself. A partnership was being built, not with grand promises, but with these quiet, consistent acts of decency. With each passing dawn, the rhythm of their vigil became a fragile, unspoken ritual. The world shrank to the circle of worn stone, the creak of the pulley as she drew her morning water, and the silhouette of a man on a horse against the rising sun. She found herself listening for the soft thud of his horse's hooves, her day not truly beginning until his silent passage. The well was no longer just a source of water. It was the axis on which their strange, tentative connection turned. The morning of the 6th day arrived with a chill that was unusual for the season. A silver mist clung to the ground, muffling sound and lending the world a ghostly pallor. The stones of the well were slick with dew, cold and damp beneath Lila's fingers as she leaned against them. The deadline was tomorrow. Her time had run out. This would be the morning she had to search, regardless of the risk. But Cole did not appear. The sky brightened from charcoal to slate, and still the road was empty. A cold knot of anxiety, sharper than the morning air, tightened in her stomach. His absence was a physical ache, a sudden and terrifying void. She had not realized how much she had come to depend on his silent watch, on the simple knowledge that he was there. Finally, she heard him. The horse's gait was faster than usual. He emerged from the mist, not with his customary calm, but with a tension in his posture that was visible even from a distance. As he drew closer, she saw a fresh bruise darkening his jawline and a small, stitched cut over his eyebrow. He dismounted, his movements stiff. "Boone was waiting for me at the livery," he said, his voice low and tight with anger. He and his friends wanted to have a discussion about my continued presence in Dry Creek. Lila's breath caught. He had taken a beating for her, for a fight that was not his. The fear she felt was no longer just for her land. It was for him. She looked at his bruised face, at the weariness in his eyes, and the carefully constructed walls around her heart crumbled into dust. She reached out, her fingers gently tracing the cold, damp curve of a well stone. "I wait at the well each morning," she said, the words coming out as a soft, aching whisper. It was a simple statement of fact, but it was laden with all the fear and hope and loneliness of the past week. "I wait for you." Cole's gaze softened. The hard lines around his mouth eased. He had spent a year waiting for nothing, running from a past he could not outrun, but for the past week, he had found himself waiting for the dawn, waiting for the sight of a lone woman standing guard over a stone well. He was waiting for a reason to be the man he had once hoped to be. He took a slow breath, the mist swirling around him. "I've been waiting for you too," he answered. The words hung in the air between them, simple, honest, and immense. It was an admission of a shared need, a confession that in this desolate place, they had become each other's anchor. The pretense of duty, of a chance encounter, fell away. All that was left was a man and a woman, standing by a well in the mist, finally admitting they were in the same fight, on the same side, and that it now mattered. "My father's letter," Lila said, her voice finding new strength. "We have to look now." There was no more time for hesitation. Together, in the secretive gray light, they knelt by the well. Lila's hands, slick with dew, ran along the rough-hewn foundation stones. Cole's larger, warmer hands followed. Checking the stones on the opposite side, their fingers brushed, sending a jolt of warmth through the cold morning. Then, her fingertips found it on the southern side, just below the lip, a stone with a crudely chiseled, 5-pointed star, no bigger than a silver dollar. It was stuck fast. Using Cole's Bowie knife, they painstakingly worked the mortar from the edges. The sound of the scraping was loud in the stillness. Finally, Cole got his fingers around the edge and pulled. The stone came free with a grating sound, revealing a dark, hollow space within. Lila reached into the cavity. Her fingers closed around a small, oilskin-wrapped package. It was heavier and thicker than she expected. She carefully unwrapped it. Inside were 2 documents. The first was the official territorial deed for her land, its paper crisp and its seal unbroken. It was the truth, undeniable and legally binding. The second document made her gasp. It was a detailed map, drawn with an engineer's precision in her father's hand. It showed the well, the surrounding land, and, sketched in blue ink, the path of the underground aquifer that fed it, and branching off that main artery, drawn in a stark, angry red, was a second line, labeled Illegal Diversion Pipe, Pike, Oct. 1878. Her father had known. He had discovered Pike's theft a year ago and had been gathering the evidence. This map was his testimony from beyond the grave. A wave of triumph washed over Lila, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. He knew. Cole. He knew everything. Cole's hand rested on her shoulder, a gesture of shared victory. This changes things. Lila, this is more than just your land. It's proof of a crime. Their moment of elation was shattered by the sharp crack of a rifle. The shot splintered the wooden well frame just above Lila's head. She cried out, stumbling back. Cole reacted instantly, shoving her down behind the low stone wall of the well. Get down. Another shot kicked up dirt where she had been standing. Shouldn't have been poking your noses where they don't belong. Boone Avery's voice echoed from a rocky outcrop 50 yards away. He was crouched, his rifle resting on a boulder, the rising sun glinting off its barrel. Cole drew his pistol, pushing Lila toward the ground. Stay flat, don't move. Boone fired again. This time, he wasn't aiming at the wall. He was aiming for Lila, for the precious papers she clutched in her hand. Cole saw the rifle shift, saw the intent in Boone's posture. He didn't think, he moved, covering her body with his own. He felt a searing, white-hot pain tear through his left bicep. It was like being struck by a hot iron poker. He grunted, the impact throwing him against the well stones. Lila screamed, her voice filled with terror, ignoring the fire in his arm. Cole pushed himself up on one elbow, his own pistol bucking in his hand. He didn't aim to kill. He aimed for the rock near Boone's head. The shot was true, sending a spray of stone chips into Boone's face. Boone yelped and ducked for cover. Go now, Cole yelled, shoving the papers into Lila's hands. Run for Nora's, I'll hold him off. He fired again, giving her the cover she needed. Lila scrambled to her feet and ran, her heart pounding in her ears, the precious documents held tight against her chest. Cole stayed low, exchanging shots with Boone, a desperate, dangerous dance in the half-light of dawn. Blood dripped from his arm, splashing onto the gray stones of the well, dark and vivid against the mist-dampened rock. It was an oath, sealed in blood on the very ground he had sworn to protect. He managed to keep Boone pinned down long enough to make his own escape, disappearing into the maze of alleys just as the town began to stir. He found Lila in the smoky, metallic-smelling shelter of Nora's smithy. Without a word, Lila tore a strip from her petticoat and began to tend his wound. The bullet had torn a clean but deep furrow through the muscle of his arm. As she worked, her hands gentle and sure, they both looked at the papers spread on a nearby anvil. The deed, the map, the truth. It was everything they needed, and it was utterly worthless here. Sheriff Carroll would burn this map before he'd look at it, Cole said through gritted teeth as Lila tightened the bandage. Then we can't stay in Dry Creek, she answered, her eyes meeting his. The fear was still there, but it was now overlaid with a new, hard resolve. The district court is in Las Cruces. It's 100 miles of open country. Cole looked at her, at the determination in her face, and then at his own bleeding arm. He had come to this town a drifter, belonging to no one and no place. Now, a woman was tying her own petticoat around his wound, and they were planning a desperate journey to fight a battle that had become his as much as hers. He nodded slowly. Get what you need. We ride at dusk. Part V, Midpoint Reversal, the road to Las Cruces. Dusk bled across the desert, erasing the hard edges of the landscape and offering a cloak of purple shadow. They left Dry Creek not as a posse, but as fugitives from a law that had already judged them. Nora Bell drove the sturdy buckboard wagon, her blacksmith's hands firm on the reins. Beside her sat Tommy, a slip of a boy, half Navajo, with eyes that saw everything and a silence that kept its own counsel. He was their guide, a boy who knew the secret ways of the desert better than any map. Inside, Cushioned by horse blankets and sacks of grain, sat Lila and Cole. The deed and her father's map were wrapped in a second layer of oilskin and stitched into the lining of Lila's dress, a secret kept close to her heart. Cole's arm was bound tightly, the throb a constant, dull metronome counting out the miles. Every jolt of the wagon sent a fresh wave of pain through him, but his face remained a stoic mask. He felt the weight of his decision, the familiar, bitter guilt of having pulled innocent people into his orbit of trouble. He had seen Nora's face as she'd locked the door to her smithy, and Tommy's as he'd said goodbye to his mother. He had started this. The fire was spreading. Lila watched him in the growing darkness. She saw the pain he tried to hide, the tension in his jaw. A year ago, a week ago, she would have resented her own dependence on his strength. Now, she felt a fierce, protective instinct. His fight was her fight, not because he was her champion, but because they had chosen to stand on the same small patch of ground, by the same well, and face the same enemy. "The first 20 miles are the worst," Tommy said, his voice soft but clear over the rattle of the wheels. Open country, easy to track. He was right. Under the cold, indifferent light of 1,000 stars, their wagon was a solitary, vulnerable vessel on a vast, dry sea. Every coyote's howl sounded like a warning, every rustle in the scrub brush like an approaching rider. They pushed the horses hard through the night, stopping only to water them from the barrels they'd brought along. A bitter irony that was not lost on any of them. They were fleeing a town for the sake of a well, carrying their own precious water with them. By the second day, the landscape had changed. The flat plains gave way to a labyrinth of red rock canyons and sun-blasted mesas. Tommy guided them through dry riverbeds and ancient trails that were invisible to the untrained eye. But they all knew they were being followed. It was a feeling, a prickle on the back of the neck. Sometimes, on a high ridge, they would see a flicker of movement in their back trail, a dust cloud that rose and settled too quickly to be the wind. "He won't send Boone," Cole said, his voice raspy from the dust. "Not for this. Boone is a bully, not a tracker. Pike will hire a professional." His words hung in the air, confirming their shared fear. They were not just running from greed now. They were being hunted. The third day, nature itself turned against them. The sky, which had been a merciless, brilliant blue, turned a sickly yellow-brown. The wind began to rise, not as a breeze, but as a low, mournful moan that grew into a physical force, pushing against the wagon and stinging their eyes with sand. "Sandstorm," Tommy said, pulling his neckerchief over his nose and mouth. "A bad one. We need to find cover." But there was no cover. They were caught in a wide, flat basin, and the storm was descending on them like a predator. Within minutes, the world disappeared. The sun was blotted out. The air became a thick churning soup of sand that clawed at their lungs and reduced visibility to less than 10 feet. The wind screamed, a physical assault that threatened to tear the canvas cover from the wagon. Nora fought to control the terrified horses, her shouts lost in the gale. Cole, his good arm braced against the wagon's side, tried to help Lila and Tommy secure their supplies. The world was chaos, a maelstrom of noise and stinging sand. Through the roaring dimness, Cole caught a glimpse of him, a rider, a ghost in the storm, sitting calmly on his horse not 50 yards away. He was a silhouette, a man in a long duster and a flat-brimmed hat, seemingly unaffected by the tempest. He just sat there, watching them, letting the storm do his work for him. The Pinkerton, a man named Hobbs, Cole would later learn, who was known for his patience and his utter lack of mercy. "He's here!" Cole yelled, but the wind snatched the words away. Just then, the front wheel of the buckboard struck a hidden rock. The impact, combined with the force of the wind, was too much. With a sickening crack of splintering wood, the wagon lurched violently and tipped over, throwing its occupants into the swirling vortex of sand. Lila was tossed clear, landing in a heap on the soft, shifting ground. The air was knocked from her lungs. Disoriented, she pushed herself up, her ears ringing. The world was a blurry nightmare. She saw Nora struggling with the panicked horses. She saw Tommy, a small, brave figure, trying to cut the traces. And then she saw Cole. He was pinned, his leg trapped beneath the heavy, overturned wagon. The massive rear wheel was pressing down on his thigh, and with every gust of wind, the wagon shifted, threatening to crush him. His face was pale, his teeth gritted in agony. The ghostly rider, Hobbs, was now slowly, deliberately dismounting, a rifle in his hand. He was going to walk over and finish the job. Something inside Lila snapped. The fear, the helplessness, the weeks of being pushed and threatened, it all coalesced into a single, white-hot point of pure resolve. She was not the girl from the well anymore. She was the woman who had learned to fire a gun, the woman who had faced down Boone Avery. She scrambled toward Cole, the wind trying to beat her back. "Nora, Tommy, help me!" she screamed, her voice raw. She grabbed the edge of the heavy wagon bed, her hands calloused from the well rope. "Found a purchase. We have to lift it." It was an impossible task. The wagon weighed over 1,000 pounds, but Nora was there in an instant, her powerful blacksmith's shoulders pressing next to Lila's. Tommy, small as he was, found a piece of splintered planking to use as a lever. On 3, Lila yelled, channeling every ounce of her will into the command, 1, 2, 3. They heaved, muscle and sinew strained against dead weight. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. The wagon groaned but did not move. Hobbs was getting closer, a phantom of death approaching through the sand. Again Lila screamed, her voice breaking. They threw their entire beings into the effort, and this time, with a groan of protesting wood and metal, the wagon lifted. Just an inch, then 2, it was enough. Cole, his face slick with sweat and grime, dragged his leg free, hissing in pain. He rolled clear just as their strength gave out and the wagon crashed back down. He was free, but his leg was badly twisted, and his wounded arm was bleeding afresh. Hobbs was less than 30 yards away. Cole tried to raise his pistol, but his hand was shaking too badly. Lila didn't hesitate. She grabbed the rifle that had been slung on Cole's saddle. It was heavier than the pistol, more awkward, but she remembered his lessons. Breathe, squeeze, don't pull. She rested the barrel on the overturned wheel, took aim at the ground in front of the approaching Pinkerton, and fired. The shot was lost in the wind, but the puff of sand at Hobbs's feet was a clear and unmistakable message. Stay back. The phantom stopped. He stared at them through the storm, at the woman holding the rifle, the injured man beside her, the blacksmith and the boy standing ready. He had expected scattered, terrified prey. He found a determined, cohesive unit, with a flicker of what might have been annoyance. He raised his rifle, but not to fire. He tipped his hat in a gesture of cold, professional respect, turned, and melted back into the storm. He was a patient man. He would wait for a better opportunity. They made it to Las Cruces 2 days later, a battered, exhausted quartet leading a limping horse and a broken wagon. The town was a sprawling hub of commerce and law, with a proper courthouse made of brick that seemed to promise a sturdier kind of justice. Leaving Nora and Tommy to see to the horses and their injuries, Lila and Cole, leaning on each other for support, walked into the territorial clerk's office. The room smelled of paper and sealing wax. A thin, balding clerk with ink-stained fingers looked up at them over his spectacles, his expression one of pure boredom. With a trembling hand, Lila presented the deed and her father's map. "We need to file this evidence," she said, her voice clear and strong, "in the matter of a fraudulent land claim in the township of Dry Creek." The clerk examined the documents without interest. He took out a new folder, wrote down their names, and placed the deed and the map inside. The circuit judge will be here in 2 weeks. The matter will be reviewed then. You will be notified." He stamped the folder and placed it on a tall stack of other files. It was done. It was official. A wave of relief so profound it made Lila feel dizzy swept through her. They had done it. They had brought the truth to the law. They spent the next few days in a cheap boarding house, waiting. Cole's leg began to heal, though his arm remained a constant aching reminder of their flight. He felt a deep, gnawing guilt. He had led them into a sandstorm, gotten himself injured, and forced Lila to become the very thing he had tried to protect her from a target. "You saved my life," he said to her one evening as she was changing the bandage on his arm. "You saved mine first," she replied simply. "I think we're even." But Lila felt her own burden, seeing the cold, calculating look on Hobbs's face. Feeling the crushing weight of the wagon, she now understood the stakes. This wasn't just about her well anymore. It was about Nora's smithy, Tommy's family, and every other person in Dry Creek living under Pike's thumb. If she failed, the whole town's future would dry up and blow away. On the 5th day, a nagging worry prompted Lila to return to the clerk's office. "I'd just like to confirm our file is in order," she said to the same clerk. The man sighed, annoyed by the interruption. He searched the stack where he had placed their folder. He searched the one next to it. He started opening drawers. A look of mild panic began to creep into his face. "I'm sorry," he said, after 10 minutes of fruitless searching, his voice not sounding sorry at all. "I can't seem to locate it. It must have been misplaced. These things happen. You'll have to file again." Lila stared at him, the blood draining from her face. She saw the lie in his shifty eyes, the slight sheen of sweat on his brow. Misplaced. The word was a knife. Their journey, the storm. Cole's injuries all for nothing. Pike's money had traveled faster than their wagon. His corruption had gotten here first. She walked out into the dusty street, the hopeful facade of the brick courthouse now looking like a tombstone. All was lost. She was standing there, hollowed out by despair, when a familiar voice called her name. She turned to see Padre Esteban dismounting from a tired-looking mule. He had traveled the 100 miles alone, his face etched with weariness and worry. "I came as soon as I could," he said, rushing to her side. "I knew you would need more than a deed and a map. You need a testament to character. You need a piece of the town's memory." From a leather satchel, he removed the old, heavy parish record book. He opened it to the page recording Lila's own baptism as an infant. In the margins, next to the names of her parents, Alistair and Elena Hart, was a note, written in the meticulous script of the previous priest. Note, land plot, and well, filed this day with the territory. Paid in full as a christening gift for the child, witnessed by God and the community. It wasn't a deed. It wasn't a map. It was something harder to forge and harder to dismiss a public record of a sacred event, inextricably tying the land to her family from the moment of her birth. It was a piece of the truth, recorded not for the law, but for God, and in a court of men. It might be the only thing that could save them. Part 6, Climax 1, Water and Fire. They saw the smoke before they heard the explosion. A pillar of dark gray rising against the pale desert sky. Miles ahead, in the direction of Dry Creek. Cole, riding ahead of the slow-moving buckboard, reined in his horse, a cold dread washing over him. Beside him, Lila stood up in the wagon, her hand shielding her eyes. Then came the sound, a low, guttural boom that rolled across the plains and vibrated deep in their bones. It was not the sharp crack of a rifle, but the world-shattering roar of dynamite. "He's done it," Nora said from the driver's seat, her voice flat with disbelief. "The canal! The madman actually did it!" They pushed the tired horses into a desperate gallop, the wagon bouncing violently over the uneven ground. As they crested the last rise overlooking the town, the scene below was one of apocalyptic chaos, a raw, muddy gash had been torn through the earth. A new, angry river where none had been before. Water, brown and churning, was pouring from the mouth of the canyon, diverted from its natural course. It wasn't flowing toward Pike's slaughterhouse. It was aimed directly at the low-lying part of town. A torrent of stolen life now turned into a weapon of destruction. And its first target was Rosie Quinn's stagecoach stop. Men were shouting, livestock were screaming, and the roar of the unnatural flood was a constant, terrifying thunder. Pike hadn't just escalated. He had declared war on the town itself. They rode into the maelstrom. The water was already ankle-deep on the main street, swirling with debris. Townsfolk were scrambling to save what they could, their face masks of panic. Cole pulled his horse alongside the wagon, his eyes meeting Lila's. The parish book, their last legal hope, was still stitched into her dress, in a town drowning under the brute force of its tyrant. The book felt impossibly fragile. "The evidence is useless if the town washes away," Lila yelled over the din. Cole's mind was moving with the speed of a battlefield scout. He saw the new canal, the raging water, and upstream, near the mouth of the canyon, a second pile of wooden crates and coiled fuses. Pike wasn't just diverting the stream. He was going to blow the canyon wall and unleash the entire aquifer in one catastrophic flood. "There's a second charge," he shouted to Lila. "If it goes, it'll take the whole valley. I have to get to that fuse." He looked at the rising water swirling around Rosie's stage stop, where the frightened owner was trying to herd terrified patrons to higher ground. Get the people safe. Get them out. It was a decision made in a split second, a division of an impossible task. He was the fighter. She had become the leader. There was no time for goodbyes. Cole spurred his horse, plunging into the current and riding hard against it, toward the dynamite. Lila leaped from the wagon before it had even stopped moving. "Nora, Tommy, help me get everyone to the church," she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority she didn't know she possessed. She grabbed a coil of rope from the wagon. The water was now at her knees, cold and strong. She saw Boone Avery and two of his men, not helping but laughing as they watched the chaos from the boardwalk of the saloon. They were enjoying the destruction, reveling in the terror Pike had unleashed. A cold fury solidified in Lila's heart, burning away the last of her fear. The stage stop was taking the brunt of the flood. The foundations were groaning, and the front porch was beginning to break apart. Rosie Lila cried, "We can't stop it, but we can slow it down. We can build a levee." With what Rosie shrieked, her face streaked with tears and muddy water. Lila's eyes scanned the area. "The general store, the storeroom. Flour," she yelled. "Sacks of flour grain, anything in a bag, Nora. Get the women, we're building a wall." It was a desperate, mad idea. But in the face of the town's paralysis, it was the only idea. Nora, her face set like stone, nodded and plunged into the flood, her powerful voice bellowing for help. One by one, then in pairs, the women of Dry Creek emerged from their homes. They were terrified, but the sight of Lila, standing resolute in the churning water, ignited a spark of defiance in them. They formed a human chain, passing heavy sacks of flour, sugar, and grain from the store to the threatened building. Their dresses soaked, their hands raw. They were mothers, wives, and widows, and they were fighting for their homes with the only weapons they had: pantry supplies and sheer, stubborn will. Lila was in the thick of it, wrestling a 100-pound sack of flour into place, the mud and water sucking at her boots. The makeshift levee began to take shape, a pale, lumpy barrier against the brown torrent. It was working. The water, diverted by their wall, began to flow down the street instead of directly into the stage stop. That's when Boone Avery decided to intervene. He sloshed through the water toward her, a cruel smile on his face. "Playing with your groceries. Girl, you think a pile of biscuits is gonna stop Judge Pike?" "Get out of the way." "Boone," Lila ordered, her voice dangerously calm. "We're saving this town." "This town belongs to the judge," he sneered, grabbing her arm. And so do you. Lila reacted on pure instinct, just as Cole had taught her. She didn't struggle. She twisted, using his momentum against him, and slammed the heel of her boot onto his instep. He howled in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was long enough. She wrenched free, stumbling back, her hand flying to the small pistol tucked in her waistband. She drew the gun. It felt steady in her hand. Boone, recovering, saw the weapon and his eyes widened in disbelief before hardening with rage. He lunged for her. Lila didn't fire at him. She fired at the watermarker post next to his head. The shot was a sharp crack that was heard even over the flood's roar. A splinter of wood flew from the post. Boone froze, his hand outstretched. He stared at the smoking hole, then at the unwavering barrel of her pistol, and finally at the cold, determined look in her eyes. This wasn't the frightened girl from the well. He took a slow, deliberate step back, his bravado washed away by the flood and a woman's resolve. He turned and retreated, defeated not by a man's strength, but by a woman's refusal to be a victim. Meanwhile, Cole was fighting a different battle. He urged his horse through the powerful current, the water tearing at its legs. He could see the second cache of dynamite wedged into a fissure in the canyon wall. A long, sputtering fuse was already burning down, its spark crawling inexorably toward the crates. He had maybe a minute. A rifle shot rang out, and a bullet sang past his ear. On the bank of the new canal stood the Pinkerton, Hobbs, his rifle at his shoulder. He had been waiting. Cole threw himself from his horse, using its body for cover as he returned fire with his pistol. It was a hopeless fight. He was out in the open, wounded, against a professional marksman with a rifle. Another shot tore through the saddlebag next to his head. He had to move. He broke cover, sprinting through the knee-deep water toward the fuse. Hobbs fired again. This time, the bullet found its mark. A searing agony erupted in Cole's right shoulder, spinning him around and knocking him to his knees. His pistol flew from his numb fingers. He was hit badly. The world was a gray, roaring haze of pain. Through it, he could see the fuse, still burning. Sparks flew, only feet from the dynamite. He thought of the fire, the one that haunted his dreams. He thought of the people who had died because he hadn't been able to stop it. Not again. With a primal roar, Cole surged to his feet and lunged, ignoring Hobbs, ignoring the fire in his shoulder. He threw himself at the canyon wall, his left hand fumbling for the burning fuse. He grabbed the sputtering cord, the heat scorching his palm, and ripped it from the detonator cap just as the final spark reached its end. Silence. The roar of the water was the only sound. He had done it. He staggered back, clutching his shattered shoulder, and finally collapsed onto the muddy bank, his strength gone. Through a curtain of pain, he saw Hobbs lower his rifle, a look of grudging admiration on his cold face. The Pinkerton then turned and walked away, disappearing into the chaos. His job was done, his target was neutralized. But as Cole lay there, the world began to change color. The gray sky was now lit by a flickering, hellish orange. He turned his head and saw it. Downstream, near Pike's slaughterhouse, a massive plume of black smoke was rising into the sky. A fire. One of Pike's oil storage sheds had gone up. Sparks, carried on the wind, were now raining down on the town. Dry Creek was caught between two apocalypses, flood and fire. Cole's vision was blurring. He knew he should stay down, that he was bleeding out, but then he saw a figure, silhouetted against the flames. It was Sheriff Caro, running from the burning shed. A flaming roof timber crashed down, blocking his path, trapping him between the fire and the rising floodwaters. Cole watched, his mind reeling. Caro, the man who had taken Lila's deed, the man who had stood by and let Pike strangle the town, the man who deserved to be left to the flames. The memory of the train fire, of the screams, of his own helplessness, rose up like bile. He had run from that fire for a year. He had defined himself by that failure. He looked at Caro, a corrupt, worthless man. And then he looked at the flames. This was a choice, not a choice between right and wrong, but between the man he had been and the man he wanted to be. An act of heroism is not defined by who you save, but by the fact that you saved them. Using the canyon wall, he dragged himself to his feet. Every movement was agony. He ripped a strip from his shirt and tied it around his shoulder, a crude and inadequate tourniquet. Then he began to stumble, to run, back toward the town, back toward the fire. He reached the burning shed just as a wall collapsed. Caro was pinned, his leg caught under a heavy, smoldering beam, the fire licking at his clothes. He was screaming, his face a mask of pure terror. "Help me," he shrieked when he saw Cole. Cole ignored the flames searing his skin, the smoke choking his lungs. He grabbed the beam. The wood was scorching hot, using every last reserve of strength, drawing on a will he didn't know he possessed. He lifted. The beam moved. Just enough. Caro scrambled free, his clothes smoldering. Cole shoved the sheriff toward the safety of the water, and then the last of his strength gave out. The world went black, and he collapsed on the threshold of the inferno. He woke to the feel of cool water on his face. Sheriff Caro was dragging him away from the fire, his face covered in soot and tears. The levee had held. The flood was receding. The fire was still burning, but was now contained. Caro was sobbing. "A broken man. You saved me," he stammered, looking at Cole's battered, bleeding body. I stood by. I took his money. I let him. And you saved me." Cole could barely breathe. He could only look at the sheriff, his eyes asking the question he was too weak to voice. Caro seemed to understand. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. It was Lila's deed, the one he had confiscated, the file in Las Cruces. Pike paid the clerk to lose it, but I made a copy of the deed first, an official, witnessed copy. He pushed the paper into Cole's hand. "I'll testify. I'll tell them everything. I swear on my life. I'll tell them what Pike did, what you did." Cole closed his eyes, the paper clutched in his hand. They had survived the water. They had survived the fire. And in the ashes, they had found the one thing they thought they had lost forever, a witness. Part 7. Climax 2 and falling action, the hearing by the water. There is no justice in a room with 4 walls when the crime was committed against the sky and the land. So the hearing was not held in the stuffy, corrupt sheriff's office, nor in the distant, compromised courthouse of Las Cruces. It was held by the old well. 3 days after the flood and the fire, the town of Dry Creek gathered. The air was still thick with the smell of wet ash and mud, but it was also clean, scoured by the violence of the preceding days. The people who assembled were not the same ones who had averted their eyes in fear. They were survivors. They were the women who had built the levee of flour, the men who had fought the fire, the families who had sheltered their neighbors. They stood with their backs straight, their faces grim, their eyes watching. Padre Esteban stood on one side of the well, his presence a moral compass. On the other stood a young, stern-faced clerk from the district court in Las Cruces, a man sent to investigate the chaos, whose satchel was filled with the authority of a law that, for the first time, felt real. Lila and Cole stood together. Cole was a patchwork of bandages, his right arm in a sling, his left shoulder stiffly bound. He leaned on a crutch, but his eyes were clear and steady. Lila, dressed in a borrowed, clean dress, held a small stack of papers that felt as heavy as stone tablets. Nora, Rosie, and young Tommy stood with them, a small but formidable coalition of the wronged. Across from them stood Judge Ephraim Pike. He was flanked by a sullen Boone Avery and the stoic, watchful Pinkerton. Hobbs. Pike had regained his composure. He was dressed in a clean suit, his face a mask of aggrieved authority. He was here. He had announced, to put an end to the baseless and destructive accusations against him. The hearing began. There was no jury box, no judge's bench. The people of the town were the jury, and the well itself was the witness stand. The young clerk, whose name was Davies, spoke first. This is an informal inquiry to gather testimony regarding the recent events. Let us begin. Lila stepped forward. Her voice did not tremble. I present the original territorial deed for this land, belonging to my father, Alastair Hart. She handed the crisp, sealed document to Davies, who examined it with a raised eyebrow. It was hidden here, Lila said, patting the stone of the well, to protect it from those who would steal it. Next, she unrolled her father's map. And this is my father's survey of the aquifer that feeds this well. And this, she pointed to the red line, is the illegal pipe Judge Pike buried to steal this town's water for his slaughterhouse. Nora Bell stepped forward, her voice ringing with the clarity of hammered steel. I found that pipe, dug it up with my own hands behind my smithy. It's still there for anyone who cares to look. A murmur went through the crowd. This was not rumor. This was the testimony of one of their own. Padre Esteban then presented the parish record book, open to the page of Lila's baptism. And here, in a record kept for God, is the note of the land's purchase as a gift for this child. The memory of this town is long. Judge Pike, longer than your forged ledgers. Rosie Quinn, her hand still trembling but her voice firm, spoke of the intimidation of the night Boone Avery had struck Lila and been driven off by Cole. Young Tommy, in a quiet, piping voice, told of seeing Pike's men with surveying tools up in the canyon weeks before the explosion. The evidence was a chain, each link forged by a different voice, wrapping itself around Ephraim Pike. He scoffed, holding his ground. The word of a blacksmith, a saloon owner, and a half-breed boy. This is nonsense. Where is your proof? And then the final link was put in place. Sheriff Caro, no longer wearing a badge, his face pale and drawn, stepped into the circle. He did not look at Pike. He looked at Cole, and then at the faces of the townspeople he had failed for so long. I am the proof, Caro said, his voice thick with shame. He held up a document. This is an official, witnessed copy of Miss Hart's deed. I made it myself before the original was misplaced in Las Cruces. Judge Pike paid the clerk, a man named Abernathy, $100 to lose the file. A collective gasp went through the crowd. He paid me for months, Caro continued, the confession pouring out of him like a sickness. He paid me to look the other way. He ordered Boone to intimidate Miss Hart, and he ordered the dynamite. He said he would wash the dissenters out. The sheriff's voice broke. He looked at the wreckage of the town around them. I stood by. I let it happen. But I won't let it happen anymore. The man who saved my life from that fire, he nodded toward Cole, is a better man of law than I ever was. I will testify to all of this under oath in any court in this territory. The chain was now a noose. Pike's face, which had been a mask of contempt, turned a mottled, furious red. The facade of the civilized judge, the pillar of the community, shattered. All that was left was the tyrant, cornered and rabid. Lies, Pike roared, his voice cracking. All of you conspiring against me. This well is the source of all this trouble. His eyes, wild and crazed, fixed on the well. Before anyone could react, he lunged, not for a gun on his hip, but for the rifle Hobbs was holding. He wrenched it from the Pinkertons' grasp. His intention was clear and insane: to destroy the well, to obliterate the symbol and source of their defiance. If I can't have the water, no one will, he screamed, swinging the rifle barrel toward the well's ancient stone frame. Lila was standing right beside it. Cole moved. He wasn't a gunman or a brawler. He was a man propelled by a single, pure instinct: protect Lila. He threw himself forward, his wounded body a shield, shoving her out of the way just as Pike pulled the trigger. The world seemed to move in slow motion. Hobbs, realizing his employer had gone mad, reached out to grab the rifle back. As Pike fired, Hobbs's hand struck the barrel. The shot went wild, not hitting the well, not hitting Cole, but tearing through the fleshy part of Pike's own gun hand. Pike screamed, a high, unmanly sound, and dropped the rifle. In the same instant, Cole, having pushed Lila to safety, pivoted on his good leg and slammed his crutch into Hobbs's chest, sending the bigger man crashing to the ground. The confrontation was over in a matter of seconds. Ephraim Pike stood there, clutching his bleeding hand, his face a mask of shock and agony, his guilt exposed for all to see by his own desperate, violent act. A profound silence fell over the crowd. They had seen the truth. They had watched the town's most powerful man try to destroy their lifeline and nearly harm a woman in the process. Then, a single voice broke the silence. It was Nora Bell. "The water belongs to the people," she said, her voice clear and strong. Another voice joined in. "It's the community's right." Then another and another, until it was a chorus. The fear that had kept them silent for years was gone, washed away by the flood, burned away by the fire. They were no longer scattered individuals. They were a community, finding its voice. They surged forward, not as a mob, but as a tide. They surrounded Pike, their faces hard and unforgiving. Boone Avery, seeing the tide turn, tried to slip away. But two ranchers grabbed him and held him fast. Cole, standing over the winded Hobbs, kept his pistol trained on the Pinkerton until Clerk Davies and two other men took him into custody. The young clerk, his face pale but resolute, took charge. "Ephraim Pike, you are under arrest for attempted destruction of property, aggravated assault, and on the sworn testimony of the sheriff, for the willful endangerment of this entire town." With rope provided by a rancher, Pike was bound, his reign of terror over. The falling action was swift and decisive, with Pike, Boone, and Hobbs all in custody. A semblance of true order returned. Sheriff Carroll walked over to Clerk Davies and unpinned the tarnished star from his vest, handing it over. "I am not fit to wear this," he said. "Before you are just a citizen," Davies replied. "I need your signature." He produced a fresh sheet of paper and a pen. "Your official deposition, attesting to everything you said here today." Carroll signed, his hand steady. It was his final act as sheriff and his first as an honest man. As Pike and his men were being led away to be held in the jail until a marshal could arrive from Las Cruces, a quiet consensus rippled through the crowd. It was a verdict rendered not by a judge, but by the collective will of the people. Padre Esteban voiced it. "The deed shows the land belongs to Lila Hart. That is the law of man. But the water belongs to Dry Creek. That is the law of survival and of God." Lila stepped forward, her gaze sweeping over the faces of her neighbors. She looked at the well, her well, the source of all her struggle, and she knew what she had to do. "The land is mine," she said, her voice carrying in the quiet air. "But the water is ours. The well will remain open to everyone." A cheer went up, a ragged, joyful sound of relief and rebirth. As if on cue, young Tommy, who had been watching everything with his wide, silent eyes, ran to the well. He grabbed the old wooden bucket, lowered it into the darkness, and began to turn the crank. The familiar squeal of the pulley was no longer a song of labor, but a song of victory. He hauled the bucket up, brimming with water that was clear, cold, and pure. It rose into the sunlight, and for a moment, the surface of the water was a perfect mirror, reflecting the blue sky, the worn stones, and the faces of the people of Dry Creek, finally united. Their reflections joined together in the life-giving water they had reclaimed as their own. Part 5. Resolution denouement. where water meets sky. Justice, once it arrives, does not immediately heal the wounds of a town. Dry Creek was free, but it was also broken. The flood had left a scar of mud and debris across the low-lying streets, and the blackened skeleton of the oil shed stood as a grim monument to Pike's reign. The people were weary, their brief, shining moment of unity giving way to the exhausting work of rebuilding. Then, as if the heavens themselves had passed judgment and were now offering a baptism, the rains came. It was not a violent storm, but a slow, steady, soaking rain that fell for 3 days and 3 nights. It was a silver curtain that washed the ash from the air, darkened the parched earth to a rich chocolate brown, and filled the depleted aquifer. The sound of it drumming on the rooftops was a lullaby, washing away the memory of explosions and angry shouts. When the sun finally returned, it shone on a new world. The mud began to dry, the creek ran clear, and in the damp earth around the old well, a miracle appeared, a carpet of tiny, resilient yellow wildflowers, their faces turned toward the sun. The town took it as a sign. The work of rebuilding began not with hammers and saws, but with a quiet, shared purpose. Lila did not begin by building a schoolhouse. Her dream, like the wildflowers, started small but was stubbornly rooted. She claimed an old, abandoned warehouse at the edge of town, a place that had been used for storing freight and had survived the chaos. Its windows were broken and its roof leaked, but it was large and filled with light. With Nora Bell's help, she began the slow work of sweeping out the dust of ages. Tommy and the other town children, drawn by a curiosity that bloomed into purpose, helped her patch the roof with scavenged tin and mend the floorboards. While Lila built a place for mines to grow, Cole built a system for the town to live. He had been a drifter, a man who left no trace. Now, he worked to create something permanent, with a quiet expertise that surprised everyone. He began to construct a series of wooden sluices and troughs leading from the well, using pine logs and Nora's tools. He engineered a distribution system, a network of wooden veins that would carry water to different parts of the town. It was the opposite of Pike's secret, thieving pipe. This was open, honest, and shared. He did not work alone. The men who had watched him face down Boone, who had seen him run into the fire, now came to offer their help. They saw in his patient, methodical labor not just a solution to their water problem, but a blueprint for a new kind of community. After a week of work, Cole called a town meeting at the well. He stood before them, his arm still in a sling but his shoulders straight. He was no longer a stranger passing through. He was a man who had invested his blood and sweat into their soil. "The well is for everyone," he said, his voice clear and calm. "But for it to work for everyone, there have to be rules, honest rules." He laid out a plan, simple and fair. He had divided the town into 4 sectors. Each sector would have an allotted time to draw water for livestock and irrigation. Household water could be drawn at any time. A small committee, with Nora Bell as its head, would oversee the schedule. Anyone caught taking more than their share would not be fined money, but would be penalized with 2 days of labor, maintaining the troughs for the whole community. It was justice, not as punishment, but as restoration. It was a law born not from a book, but from the shared needs of the people. They agreed unanimously. The daily ritual of drawing water, once a source of conflict and anxiety, became a quiet act of civic grace. The love between Lila and Cole grew in the same way the town was healing, not in grand pronouncements, but in the small, steady work of each day. It was in the way he would appear at the warehouse at noon with a piece of bread and cheese for her. It was in the way she would bring a cool bucket of water to him as he worked on the troughs under the hot sun. Their love was a language of shared labor, of mutual respect. A silent conversation understood across a dusty street. One evening, the rains returned, a soft, gentle patter on the roof of Rosie's rebuilt porch. The stagecoach stop was quiet, the town asleep. Lila and Cole sat together on the porch swing, a blanket over their laps, watching the rain fall. The air smelled of wet earth and pine from the new water troughs. For a long time, they said nothing, simply listening to the rhythm of the rain and the occasional, gentle thump of the well bucket as it swayed in the wind and tapped against the wooden frame. "I was always so afraid," Lila said, her voice soft as the rain. "My whole life, it feels like I've been bracing for the next blow. I thought if I kept my head down, if I made myself small enough, the trouble would pass me by." Cole looked at her, at the strength in her profile lit by the lantern light from the window. "It doesn't work that way," he said. "Trouble finds you anyway. Running doesn't help either." His hand found hers under the blanket. His fingers were calloused and warm, and they wrapped around hers with a comforting certainty. "I spent a year running from a fire," he continued, his voice low. "From the ghosts of the people who died on that train. I thought if I never stayed in one place, never let anyone get close, I couldn't cause any more harm. I thought I didn't deserve a home." And now she whispered. He squeezed her hand. "Now I think maybe a home isn't something you deserve. It's something you build, with other people. You build it out of flour sacks and pine logs. You build it by choosing to stay, even when you're afraid." He turned to face her, his eyes full of a vulnerability she had never seen before. "I'm still afraid. Lila, I'm afraid I'll fail again, that the fire inside me will—" "I'm not afraid of that fire," she said, her voice full of a fierce, unwavering conviction. "I've seen it. It's the fire that saved a man who betrayed you. It's the fire that kept a town from washing away. It's a fire that gives warmth, not one that burns." She leaned her head on his uninjured shoulder, and they sat in a comfortable silence, their hands intertwined, listening to the rain. They were two wounded people who had found in each other not a cure, but a quiet place to heal. They had chosen to stay. They were home. The next morning, Lila hung a new, hand-painted sign above the door of the warehouse. It read, "Clearwater School. Let those who thirst come to learn. Let those who know come to teach." Classes started the following week. She had 7 students, ranging in age from 6 to 14. She taught them reading from an old book of her father's poems, and arithmetic by counting the wildflowers by the well. That same afternoon, Cole sat at a table in the stagecoach stop with a pen, ink, and a clean sheet of paper. It took him over an hour, his brow furrowed in concentration, his left hand clumsy and slow. He was writing a letter. It was addressed to the office of the Union Pacific Railroad, with instructions to forward it to the families of the victims of the Black Creek derailment. He did not ask for forgiveness. He knew he had no right. He simply told them his story. He told them about a town called Dry Creek, about a corrupt judge, and about a woman of incredible courage. He wrote about a flood and a fire, and about how this time he had chosen to run toward the flames instead of away. He wrote that he was helping to rebuild a community, and that he hoped, in some small way, this work would honor the lives that had been lost. When he was finished, he sealed the envelope and handed it to the stagecoach driver. It was the heaviest and the lightest thing he had ever held. A month later, on a clear, cool evening, Lila and Cole walked to the well to draw the last bucket of water for the night. The town was peaceful, the lights in the windows casting a warm, gentle glow. The troughs Cole had built were dark with moisture, the pine wood already worn smooth by the flow of shared water. They stood together, looking down into the darkness of the well. Cole lowered the bucket, the pulley squealing its familiar, comforting song. When he hauled it up, the water was so still it was like a black, polished mirror. Lila leaned over the edge, and Cole stood beside her, his arm around her waist. In the perfect, dark surface of the water, they saw their own reflections, and reflected around them. And in them was the vast, star-dusted expanse of the desert sky. A man and a woman. A past full of scars and a future full of stars. all held together in a single bucket of water, drawn from the heart of the home they had built. The water had met the sky, and they were finally at peace. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed our tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.